This episode of New Politics was released on the 27th of April, 2024, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Welcome to New Politics. In this episode, Australia is the second best performing economy in the G20, but is anyone listening? The future made in Australia, is it for real or just another announcement? Who's going to win the battle between Elon Musk and the government? And we need real reform for HECS debts and school education funding. I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis, official babysitter for Arj Barker concerts.
And just our regular message, if you'd like to support New Politics, you can support us through Patreon or Substack, or you can go to newpolitics.com.au and purchase one of our books. And all of this is a good way to support independent journalism. Australia has risen in the ranks of the best performing economies in the world, and it's currently ranked second in all G20 countries. And as a comparison, it was ranked 14th in 2021 in the final year of the coalition in office. And also as a comparison, Australia was ranked number 107 out of 116 world economies in 2019, and that's almost last. And that was after 6 years of the coalition in government from 2013 to 2019. And today, Australia is ranked at number 42. And that is a massive improvement over the past 2 years. And these rankings are not being produced by left-wing think tanks or by the International Socialist or by radical unions. These rankings have been produced by the International Monetary Fund, and there would be a lot of people out there who probably wouldn't be thinking too much about these rankings. They don't care too much about how Australia performs compared to the United States or to South Korea or to Canada, which is number one in these rankings. They're more concerned about how the economy performs according to their needs and the needs of the community. But on a macro level, it does show that the Australian economy is performing very well.
Yeah, it's always the case and has been since at least 1983, but I also suspect throughout the 40s, almost certainly from 1972, the Labor Party manages the economy better, particularly if there's a bit of long-term life in the government. Australia avoids the 2008 crash thanks to Wayne Swan, who's become a bit of an underrated treasurer. Everybody points back to Paul Keating, but Swan performs just as well as Keating does. Both of them were Finance Ministers of the Year in those various awards that really don't mean much, except no Liberal treasurer has ever got it. So it becomes bragging points for the Labor Party. Money Magazine is the journal that awards this stuff. And there's still a long way to go with reforming the economy. The 9 years of Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison really did a lot of damage. So I think we've got to be careful in overpraising the economy, but we can acknowledge that the Treasurer in particular, Dr. Jim Chalmers, is doing a rather good job in trying to fix a very broken economy.
And I have noticed that the coalition rarely rates very well in these rankings, and we're not going to be totally dismissive of their economic credentials. It is their ideological approach to government that means that they're probably best suited to governing when the economic circumstances are very favourable, and they're not suited to governing when the going gets hard. And they left behind massive economic problems when they left office in 1972, in 1983 and 2022. And you could argue that 27 was an exception to all of this, yet they squandered the mining boom of the early 2000s and left a lot of budget problems that still persist up until today. But despite all of this, there is still that perception that the coalition is the better economic manager. And despite what the Australian Financial Review keeps saying, as well as the rest of the mainstream media, the evidence just isn't there. And while people might not be feeling like the economy is going well, my feeling is that the government is slowly restructuring the economy for the future. The world changes every day, economies change every day, and I think that a progressive way of economic thinking is an absolute necessity. And we've talked about this before, David. It's not like neoliberalism just ended yesterday and now we've got new Keynesianism. New economic models take a while to make a transition. And I think we're going through a transitional stage at the moment. And the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, was recently in the United States, and here's what he had to say about the changing economic circumstances, the upcoming budget and the future budgets, if he's the one who ends up delivering them.
Because our investments are all about trying to make sure our economy can be more competitive and more productive so that we can grow with low inflation into the future. And also it's important to recognise that the sorts of investments that we are contemplating, they will be big, they will be substantial, but they won't all hit the economy at once in the first year. The plan that we present in our budget will be a medium-term plan, a longer-term plan. There will be some investments up front, but not all of the investments. And I think that's a really important consideration, because for Australia, our big economic opportunities lie at the intersection of the energy transformation, our resources base, our industrial composition, our skills and human capital base, our investment strategy and our advantages there. Our big emphasis, if we are given the opportunity to govern for another term, will be getting this energy transformation right, building more homes for more Australians, making sure we get the human capital base right in our economy, and making sure that our economy is as competitive and dynamic and productive as it can be. We've got more reforms to make in the course of this term before we contemplate the next term. We've publicly flagged an overhaul of our foreign investment regime, for example. We're changing our competition arrangements when it comes to mergers and acquisitions. So we've got a really substantial, very ambitious reform agenda. The budget will be part of that, but it doesn't begin and end with the budget.
So it seems that economic reforms are on the agenda, and how much reform we're not sure, but economies never stand still. It's almost like retail shops always being on sale. You can't stand still on economic reform. It always needs to change, but it always has to be in the interests of the community. Otherwise, there's no point to it.
Yeah, I mean, an economy needs to be agile. We can't rely on stable incomes and commodities in the way that we might have could in the 1950s. Now, the 1950s, in retrospect, were wasted years for the economy. The economy did well pretty much for the same reason the economy did well in the 1990s. There was one sector doing very well, and the government, instead of using that to build new ways of building into the economy, rested on the laurels of, in that case, agriculture. By the 90s, it was mining. That's not to say there weren't other things happening, but had they been a bit more agile in jumping on some of the trends of the 1950s, Australia probably would have been in a much better position. We would have rejected the neoliberalism of Howard and Hawke and Keating and been a bit more competitive globally in the times we were, which is what happens, as I alluded to before, with Swan. They realised that the best way to get money flowing into the economy is to inject money into the economy. That money floats up. It's time we got more agile thinkers. And of course, the Liberal Party don't want this, because no matter how much press support they get, the figures don't lie. You can sort of say, oh, look how much better things were under the Liberal Party. Maybe, maybe not. But when you look at the figures, the Liberal Party, since Howard as Treasurer in 1977 at least, have been the worst economic managers, leading us into recession, leading us into higher costs. Now, of course, there's a sense in which they prefer this, because recessions benefit the wealthy. Higher costs benefit the wealthy. The Liberal Party wants to benefit the wealthy, and that's an easy way to do that. But a better economy is where as many people as possible benefit, not just the small wealthy.
And the long-term success of any government is usually based on the economy. And yes, I do realise that the coalition were poor economic managers in the 2010s, but still managed to hold on to government for 9 years and almost destroy the economy. And I think it's a reflection of Bill Clinton's comment from 1992. It's the economy, stupid. And maybe that's not always the case, because although the economy might be doing pretty well at the moment, that's not translating into big support for the Prime Minister. Anthony Albanese still has got a negative approval rating, and that's been negative since September 2023. Peter Dutton's approval rating is positive for the first time ever. And both leaders have got very high disapproval ratings, but I think there's different reasons for their high disapprovals, respectively. But Albanese's personal ratings drop coincided with the Voice of Parliament debate last year and never really recovered. Maybe there's that racist undercurrent in Australia that decided that Albanese has to be permanently punished for supporting the Voice of Parliament last year. And I'm not sure what it says about Australia that someone like Peter Dutton, who's so divisive and so incompetent, is competitive in the polls, but that's a different issue, not for today, I guess. The other point is that the media rarely rates Labor's economic performances. It's always terrible, irrespective of whatever the circumstances are. The Financial Review suggested that surrounding all of this economic good news, Jim Chalmers is writing his own report card as if to say that he's cheating. They also dismissed the IMF ranking as well. But despite all of the noise that's coming from the media, the government overall is still polling well, despite Albanese's high disapproval rating. There is a budget coming up soon. This usually provides the government of the day with a bit of a boost. We already know what the media will say about whatever is released. Last year they lambasted the Labor government for delivering a surplus, even though it's been the media's holy grail for well over 15 years. And when it finally arrived, they didn't want this budget surplus anymore. But I think the government just has to do what's right for the economy. It's never going to get the support from the media or from the coalition for all the good things that they might be doing. So I think they just need to ignore that and keep on that economic path that they're going on.
Now, we've said this a million times, so those of you who have heard this can fast forward on to the next bit where we've got a lot of really good stuff to say. Our press really lets the Australian populace down. They don't want a Labor government. They don't want a Greens government. They don't really want a Clive Palmer or a One Nation or any other. They want a Liberal government because they've built all their networking into making sure that they get in the types of people they want who will listen to what they say and do as they want them to do. The Australian populace really wants a government who works for the betterment of all of Australia. Now, that in itself is a whole argument. How do you do that? And that's perfectly okay. But I think when we do get governments in who work for the genuine betterment for all Australia, and there's a lot to criticise, by the way, about the current Labor government, but economically, they've outperformed the coalition within, 18 months. That's in itself an achievement that should be noticed and discussed, and the reasons for this examined. And of course the Treasurer writes his or her own report card, but the good ones back it up with the figures. And then you get other people checking the work, as it were. So we can ignore all of that basically bleating from a group who have realised that they're going to lose the next election anyway.
There was also the recent announcement by the Prime Minister of the Future Made in Australia program, and to me this seems like a good idea. It's based on large-scale renewable energy projects that relate to the domestic manufacture of batteries and solar panelling, leading to the creation of new local jobs in manufacturing. It also involves advanced manufacturing. And at this stage, it does seem like a good idea, but there's no great detail on what it is or what the budget spending will be. It is going to support renewable energy, offer more training and education opportunities. It will free up supply chain issues that have hampered the Australian economy over the past few years. Here's the Prime Minister talking about the Future Made in Australia program.
My ambition is for a future made in Australia. There's a global race for opportunity and jobs, and I want Australia to be in it to win it. We can make more things here. We can compete with the world. We need to identify where Australia has a comparative advantage, such as in green hydrogen, producing green steel and green aluminium, producing batteries as well. And we need as well to look at our national sovereignty and where we need to ensure that we can stand on our own 2 feet. We can't be vulnerable. That is one of the lessons of the global pandemic, is that we do need a more resilient economy that's about a future made here. It's about using the assets that we have under the ground, in the sky, to produce advanced manufacturing, creating jobs and economic growth and prosperity right here in Australia.
But so far there seems to be a lot of support within the community. The Australian Industry Group is very supportive, as is the Climate Council. The unions are behind it, and it seems like there's support within the electorate as well. But every good deed has to be punished. Peter Dutton has come in to slam this idea, as has News Corporation, as has Nine Fairfax Media. So far, this is only a sketch of an idea. The full details are going to be released in the budget in May, but there's already the howls of protectionism, that the government is hopeless at picking winners and government intervention is terrible. Now, they don't seem to have any problems when the government intervenes in the private marketplace when it shouldn't, such as the private housing market or private health or private aged care.
Private education.
And private education, but they'll just rubbish anything that comes from a Labor government, even before all of the full details are released.
Yeah, and I really do not enjoy saying this. I would love to have a system where we had a party with constructive ideas, even if I disagreed with them. But okay, they're doing this and this is why they're doing it, and I can see why this might benefit in some ways, but the flaws are here and here and here, instead of a party that just wants to not do anything and stop everything. But we don't have enough detail as to what the Labor package is going to be. But in fairness, they've just announced it. They're trying to show that they do have a vision, they do have a plan, and that they can work it out. When the costing details come out, when the logistics details come out, we can then look at it and say, yeah, this is a terrible idea, or yeah, this is a great idea, depending on what they are. The fact that they're actually making an announcement, there's a part of me thinking it is a bit Morrison-esque, make an announcement then move on to the next thing, but this seems a bit more substantial. So I'm going to say to them, release the details, but with what we know so far, it does seem promising.
And whenever the coalition does anything that resembles Labor-style policy, it's always applauded. When Scott Morrison announced the JobKeeper support program at the early stages of the COVID pandemic, the media labelled it as Whitlam-esque. It was eye-watering, and that Scott Morrison was an even better Prime Minister than Bob Hawke, and that turned out to be a little bit premature. And all of this was watched with great awe by the mainstream media journalists. But when a Labor government implements Labor-style policy, because guess what, they're a Labor government, and it's something that would be good for the manufacturing sector, it's always ridiculed and rubbished and trashed. So it's obvious that the mainstream media is pro-neoliberalism, it's pro-absolute free markets, and they're not going to like what's starting to happen now, which is what we discussed in the previous section, which is the starting of a flow against this third wave of economic globalisation, which probably commenced in the early 1990s. Countries are starting to think more locally and look at their own competitive advantages. The United States is doing this with the recent Inflation Reduction Act and CHIPS Act, and that's to boost semiconductor manufacturing, research and design. Indonesia and Japan are looking at the same issues as well. And some of this is because of economic necessity, and some of it is to curtail China, because most of this stuff is produced over in China. And all of this might result in some disputes through the World Trade Organization and probably some trade wars around the world in the near future. But if the future made in Australia is anything like the new policies that have been announced in the United States, I think it could have a very positive effect on the Australian economy.
Again, there's not much I can add to what you just said. That was spot on. I think the Labor Party has to gain a bit of confidence and ignore the press and go in believing what they're doing is right. If it's not right, the electorate will tell them so, and the figures will tell them so. But I'd rather have a government with some belief, with some conviction, than a government too scared to do anything. And again, this is why the Future Fund, if it's not just a Morrison-esque announcement, fills me with a bit of hope. We still have issues in foreign policy that need to be fixed, and it looks like they're starting to try and fix it, although that may be too late. Not electorally, but morally and spiritually maybe too late. But again, we'll see.
And Australia doesn't really have a competitive advantage in any area of large-scale manufacturing, but it can develop advantages in advanced manufacturing. That relates to areas in chemical or medicinal areas, automation and software, things like a bricklaying robot, which was developed in Western Australia and is now being exported to the world. There's other smaller niche producers and manufacturers. We record our podcast with Rode microphones, and some of these are the best microphones in the world, and they are manufactured locally. And this is not a plug. We don't get any advertising support from Rode microphones, but there are...
If they were to email us, so we're more than happy to consider it.
Of course we would be. But there are some very good audio products manufactured in Australia. And I'm not an economic nationalist, but if there can be competitive advantages for these niche producers in Australia, well, I think that should be supported. And countries have also learned some of the lessons from COVID. International supply chains can affect domestic economies and also cause political problems for a government. And blaming high local costs on supply chain issues caused by the conflicts in Ukraine or in the Middle East, well, that can work politically, but only for a certain period of time. Governments are expected to deal with problems irrespective of how difficult they might be, and there is an expectation that these issues need to be resolved. So Future Made in Australia, as you mentioned before, David, it does sound like one of those Scott Morrison announcements that sounded pretty good and gets some headlines but never actually came to fruition. And I think this is what Anthony Albanese does need to be careful of. There has to be some substance, or quite a lot of substance, to the Future Made in Australia. Otherwise he's going to pay a high political cost if it doesn't work out.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, one of Australia's top 10 podcasts on Australian politics and news commentary. You can also find us at newpolitics.com.au, and you can also support us through Patreon and Substack.
It looks like the road to heaven, but it feels like the road to hell. When I knew which side my bread was buttered, I took the knife as well. Posing for another picture, everybody's got to sell. But when you shake your ass, you know it's fast. Some mistakes were built to last. All we have to do now is take these lies and make them true somehow. All we have to see is that I don't belong to you and you don't belong to me. Yeah, yeah.
There's been a debate about the limits of free speech, and this time it's about whether Twitter X should be forced to remove videos of the violent stabbing that occurred in Sydney's West last week, and that was the incident involving Bishop Emmanuel from the Assyrian Church. And the material has been geo-blocked in Australia following a federal court ruling, but it's still available in every other country in the world. And the federal government has gone to war with Elon Musk, the owner of Twitter X, and they've requested that he removes the footage completely, and now it's dragged so many people into this whole saga. Here's what the Prime Minister said during the week.
Well, this guy is showing his arrogance. He's a billionaire over there in the United States who thinks he's above Australian law. And he's fighting for the right to show violent videos on his platform, something that can cause damage to young people, we know, and a great deal of distress, something that will add to social division. The E-Safety Commissioner has made a ruling. The other social media platforms all complied without complaint. This is a measure that has a bipartisan support in this country. Australians are united. This isn't about censorship, it's about common sense and common decency, and Elon Musk should show some.
Libertarians have been outraged by Anthony Albanese's attacks on Twitter X and Elon Musk, and they claim that they'll never vote for him again. I don't think they ever voted for him in the first place. They've also attacked Peter Dutton as well for supporting the government, claiming that they'll never vote for him either. And they might also be suggesting this because he said yes to something rather than the usual no. Senator Jackie Lambie has deleted her Twitter account and wants other politicians to follow. Senator Rolf Babbitt has reposted the offending footage online and claims that it's all an attack on the freedom of speech. Now, I think there's a number of different ways of looking at this, and of course there's going to be inconsistencies. There has been a great deal of brutal footage that has been seen on social media detailing the atrocities and genocide committed by Israel in Gaza and by the Russian military in Ukraine, and that has led to international protests by many people and some governments. Now, I think that we'd be outraged if the government called for the removal of this footage from Gaza and Ukraine so that no one could ever see it. And we've also called for reforms of all kinds of media, social media and mainstream media. But I think in this situation, it might be a case of being careful for what you wish for.
Yeah, that stabbing is distressing for a lot of people. It was too close to home. It needed to be given trigger warnings. I am wondering if the reason that there's been a lot of howls of complaint is because the mainstream media couldn't show it. Because you can guarantee if they were allowed to show it, they would have shown it. The footage doesn't appear to be that clear as to what's going on. The libertarian viewpoint is probably the most selfish of all viewpoints because it allows for the rights of the individual over everybody else. The trouble with that is that if we're all individuals, we're all stepping on each other's toes. If you can get through Atlas Shrugged or any of the Ayn Rand nonsense books, you can see just how stupid it is. It sounds good till you realise that all the people around the main characters also have to live with this selfish tool. And if they started living that way, that things become actually, you get a lot less freedom because you're prevented from doing stuff rather than allowed to do stuff that benefits everybody. It's a tough question. Do we not allow it? Because it's disturbing. Bishop Emmanuel, his opinions aren't in line with us, for example, but that doesn't mean to say he should be stabbed. The kid who did it clearly needed a lot more support, as we discussed last week, but to watch it is a very disturbing. Jackie Lambie deleting her Twitter account, I think, is something that she will regret. Even though it's much worse than it used to be, it's still a good way of getting your message out and avoiding the editorial selections of the mainstream media. Babbitt is not worth discussing, and I shouldn't have even said his name, but I guess we have to know. He told the Australian government to go f*** yourself. And why are you there? If you feel that badly about it, what possible good could you do? So get out of Parliament and stay out. Elon Musk has not run Twitter well.
Oh, well, I think there has to be a combination of rights for consumers of media, whether that's social media or legacy media, and there has to be the responsibilities of the providers and the carriers of that media.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
Elon Musk lives in some kind of libertarian bubble that most of those tech operators like Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg also seem to live in. And we also have to remember that Zuckerberg didn't want to remove the footage on Facebook of the Australian terrorists who committed the Christchurch massacres in 2019, but he did eventually remove it when he realised that it would affect the Meta business. And Elon Musk, I think he certainly is an arrogant billionaire that Anthony Albanese suggested. He unblocked Donald Trump from Twitter. There's more unwanted porn ads and porn accounts on Twitter. He's broken down all of those silos that used to exist on Twitter. So, now you end up getting all of those all caps shouting the abuse and unwanted material from right-wingers, cookers, racists and nutcases, even though you didn't ask for it. So I think it's a question of what is the right balance. And I think we can agree that a stabbing attack or a massacre of 50 people in Christchurch is something that we shouldn't see online. But what about Gaza and Ukraine? The world should be seeing that so we can see what awful governments are doing to civilians. But who decides? Personally, I think that Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg are libertarian extremists, and I wouldn't want them deciding. And there are also some suspicions that Elon Musk is using his platform to actively discourage negative commentary about the Israel government. But generally, I'm not sure what the answer is. Here's Senator Sarah Hanson-Young giving her perspectives on the issue.
Let me just say first up, I think the behaviour of Elon Musk and X, Twitter, has just been appalling. And they clearly have no social conscience. They clearly have no intention of being a good corporate citizen. I think he's a bit of a narcissistic cowboy, frankly, and he gets off on this stuff. However, the community deserve better than this, and they are looking to the Parliament and the government to act. We all have to be much more responsible than what Elon Musk is, the standard Elon Musk is setting. We need an overhaul of the regulation of these big tech platforms, and they've had very little to no regulation. They're not taxed, and they've been able to carry on in the Wild West. A lot of the damage is already done. We need to be getting to what really drives this. We have to dismantle their business model. It's the algorithms that they keep secret that drive things going viral. It wasn't regular Australians and users who made those horrible videos go viral over the last week. It's the algorithm that they used to drive their business, to drive profit. And frankly, we should be taxing them. It just blows my mind that these companies come to Australia, they take the users' data, they sell it as advertisers, they make billions and billions of dollars, and they give nothing back.
Perhaps it's a case where if you don't want to see it, you shouldn't have to, and it shouldn't be forced upon you. And this is all the behaviour of these algorithms that cause this type of material to go viral. And it's largely controlled by right-wing conservative maniacs, and they generally control what we see, whether it's by direct editorial decisions or managed through algorithms. And we also have the irony of Anthony Albanese attacking the social media companies but doing nothing about mainstream media. It would have been great if he publicly attacked Rupert Murdoch and Kerry Stokes and called them arrogant billionaires, which is what they are. And if we are going to start regulating social media, which does give the public more of a voice and influence than legacy media ever will, we have to start putting tighter controls on mainstream media. News Corporation has done far more damage than Elon Musk ever has, and at least he's developed some nice looking cars and delivered a nice big renewable energy battery for South Australia. But what has News Corporation ever done that's been good for this world?
And yeah, I'm no fan of Elon Musk, but I am in favour of giving credit where it's due. And yes, it is the technology owned by Musk, not necessarily developed by Musk, as he likes to suggest, that has done a lot of good. And thanks to the big battery. The Tesla car is a bit of a bomb, but it's still early days. So let's be fair. SpaceX was a bit of a flop, but again, it's still early days. But the batteries have been very good, and he should get some appreciation for that, even from people who disagree with him. It's easy to be a libertarian when you are privileged, because all these people who work for you, you can pay off if in the worst case, or you can sack. And that's the trouble. And yeah, the other point is that it's one thing to go after social media. It's another thing to go after mass media. And if they were really serious, they'd go after both. There is an absolute responsibility to be as true as you can, to be as fair as you can, and to be as honest as you can. And certainly the Australian legacy media doesn't always reach those ideals, shall we say.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible, Google Podcasts and YouTube.
Education is likely to feature prominently in the coming months and in two areas, and that's higher education and school education. And during the week, the Prime Minister suggested that there might be some relief for graduates with HECS debts, and it might be a case of too little, too late. HECS debts are increased by the Consumer Price Index, and last year they went up by 7.1%, which means that even if a graduate was working full-time on an average wage and paying off their HECS debts throughout the year, their overall HECS debt would have actually gone up. And it's going to be a similar situation this year. The CPI for this year is likely to be around 4.8%. And if it continues like this, you'll have a situation where graduates will pay off HECS debts for the rest of their working lives and still have a massive HECS debt when they retire, and that's unsustainable. And in the last financial year, the government collected $2.3 billion in the petroleum resources rent tax and $4.9 billion in HECS debts, and next year it's going to be a lot more than that. Fossil fuel industries, they also get around $11 billion in subsidies and tax breaks, and it also compares with the cost of excess franking credits, which is $5.3 billion in benefits for self-funded retirees. So once again, the government has got its priorities wrong. We'll have to wait and see what the budget has in store for graduates with HECS debts, but it probably would be better to wipe these debts off completely.
It was a big policy failure of the Labor government. Massive policy failure. John Dawkins should hold his head in shame. It did exactly what it shouldn't have done. It started to exclude everyone from university. And the whole idea of free education was that one of the barriers that prevented people going to university, that was the cost, was completely removed. Even the Menzies government understood that and put in a whole lot of scholarships. Now, that probably wasn't the right way, but given the Menzies government's ideologies, etc., it was at least a way of getting more people into university. Gough Whitlam removed all fees from university except for, I think, textbooks and the student union fees, which were pretty nominal at the time, without having to worry about paying for the course. You could go to university, and one of the things that Whitlam said was the amount of people who thanked him for being able to get to university and get out of the cycle of poverty from Western Sydney. Now, of course, there's a group of right-wing voters who hate the fact that poor people, women, people of colour, disabled people could get to university. And sure, there's an idea of merit, but the merit should be in, are you one of those who are suited to university? And a lot of the Whitlam people were suited to university. A whole generation of teachers, of public servants, of entrepreneurs, of lawyers, of health professionals, of analysts, of creatives went through who wouldn't have got through if it wasn't for free. When John Dawkins brings in HECS, he starts to take that out. And of course, if you bring a fee in, the next time a Liberal government comes in, they will raise it. So we've got to stop this nonsense altogether and make it so that it can't be reintroduced. Education should be public and it should be free, because ultimately you get a better society out of it. And of course, there are those right-wing thinkers who don't want a better society. They want people as non-thinking sheep, so you'll keep voting for them. If Labor want to try and improve their legacy, they get rid of HECS and they forgive every HECS debt.
Oh, and David, we've talked about this before. You know, something just needs to give in this area, and maybe it's just not these piecemeal attempts that have been made or need to be made. The entire tax system needs to be reassessed and overhauled. And we've been advocates of the Henry Review from 2010, and I know that that was 14 years ago, and that was commissioned by the Rudd government, but only 3 of the 138 recommendations were ever implemented. But there's just a lot of discrepancies in inequities within the current taxation system. A tax on learning, a tax on education. HECS, as you mentioned, was introduced by a Labor government, but it's a very un-Labor type of scheme. You know, why not mix up the tax system, boost the petroleum resources rent tax and get the $7 billion in revenue from there, cancel HECS debts. There's your problem solved. Increase the tax on liquid petroleum gas from $1 billion a year to $26 billion a year, just like Qatar does for the same amount of gas, and maybe use that to fund Australia's version of Al Jazeera, and we could almost start paving the roads with gold as well. There's just so much revenue that could be gained by taxing the right areas. Gina Reinhardt gets the 2024 Ayn Rand Award for Lifetime Achievement and the Australian Financial Review's Business Person of the Year Award, but she pays low levels of tax. You know, stop giving these people awards, start taxing them correctly. Many of Australia's financial problems would be gone if the government just started making these people pay their fair share of tax.
That's exactly right. Get rid of GST. It's an iniquitous system that hits the poor. 10% of outgo is not necessarily 10% of income. In some cases, it's much less. In some cases, it's much more. So we have a broken tax system, an overly complex tax system. We need to break it all down, because at the moment, any reform is generally minor and tinkering at the edge, or cutting into those who can least afford it. Property values, the big factor is the incredibly generous tax breaks people get. The income tiers have to be rethought, maybe another higher amount, whereas once you're over $10 million, you get taxed at 95% or 90%. And you think, oh, gee, that's a lot. But that level of tax only came in at the top. So there comes a point where you're paying back to society the great generosity that it has afforded you through essentially luck, hard work, a bit of talent and circumstance.
Oh, but I guess the point is that if you're collecting more from an education debt, compared to a petrol tax. Well, that indicates that there's problems within the taxation system.
Oh, absolutely.
And this would be a long-term effect of having piecemeal approaches to taxation reform rather than looking at the overall system and saying, well, look, this is not working. We shouldn't be collecting this much money from tax and so little money from a resources tax. We should be balancing that up so that we are prioritising the things that are important to the community.
Exactly. And what's important to the community is access to education, access to health, access to other government services, properly funded legal aid, properly funded Centrelink, properly funded mental health, properly funded stuff that we need, not stuff that they want. And that's the difference.
And the other area of attention in education is private school funding, and there were well over 1,000 private schools, or 40% of all private schools across Australia, that received more federal government funding than they were entitled to. And this cost the federal government $2.5 billion in the last financial year. And of these 1,000 private schools, 40 schools received $2 million more than they were entitled to, including several prestigious schools in Melbourne that received more than $5 million in overfunding. And you just have to wonder, how does this happen? And David, you and I have been on the P&C at public schools, and I can't remember any of the principals turning up to a meeting to say, well, you wouldn't believe it, we've just stumbled across an extra $5 million from the federal government, and we'll use that as a down payment on an Olympic-sized pool in the middle of the playground because we've got nowhere else to put it. This is just outrageous. And why isn't the federal government doing something about this? Part of the problem is that once the money is there and expected to continue arriving into the future, it's just very hard for governments to pull that back. But this is at a time when public schools are really struggling for funds, as they usually do, and not much is being done about this. And this probably won't be addressed in the next budget, but this is a continuing problem for Australian public schools. It's an issue about equity and access to quality education for all students.
The big lie is that the money to the private schools takes the pressure off public schools. In fact, it puts a lot more pressure on public schools, because if that money went into public schools, we wouldn't have a problem. Australia is the only country that publicly funds private schools. As I understand it, a lot of especially the elite private schools, actually understand that they're going to lose it at some point, which is why they're doing the big builds while they've got the money. And of course, it came to the point where they'd run out of big builds to do, so they're just trying to spend. So you get student car parks. Think about that, student car parks. The Olympic swimming pool, the polo fields. None of this helps in education. None of this has got anything to do with the intellectual and ethical improvement of students. There's plenty of good public pools around that the public schools traipse their students down to for swimming carnivals, etc. It's a rort and it's a con. So we've got to stop the funding to private schools. There's no justification for it. There's no benefit in it, except for a few. I mean, what type of country allows the more wealthy to get benefits that less wealthy really need? It says a lot about our wealthy class that they need government help to stay wealthy. It's not an entrepreneurial society. And I do know, too, that one of the arguments is that the local schools in our area aren't very good. They're not appropriate for my students' needs or my child's needs. That's fair. But if the money that was going into the private schools went into the public schools, a lot of those issues would be fixed too. And if the wealthier parents were in public schools, that helps solve problems as well.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.
I have to celebrate you, baby. I have to praise you like I should.